This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We start off this Monday's programming with an update on the activity taking place in the cattle markets last week. In addition to the cattle market report, Katelyn McCullock, director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, discusses some unusual activity in the hog market, a slowdown in rebuilding the U.S. cattle herd, and some of the things LMIC will be watching closely in the coming months. Also ahead, with spring just around the corner, K-State wheat and forage specialist Romulo Lollato shares insight on tools for estimating first hollow stem in wheat. The important growing stage serves as an indicator for when those with dual-purpose grazing systems need to consider removing animals to minimize grain yield losses. We end today's show with this week's wildlife segment, where we are joined by K-State aquatics and fisheries specialist Joe Gerken. Joe discusses getting ahead with controlling algae in ponds and short-term versus long-term management options. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Well, we start off today's program with our weekly update on the activity taking place in the cattle market last week. In addition to the cattle market report, though, Katelyn McCullock, director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, also has information on some unusual activity taking place in the hog market, resulting from uncertainty created by the collapse of two major banks. Katelyn also discusses the potential impact of a cattle inventory that isn't growing and doesn't appear to be increasing in size anytime soon. She also looks at a few of the things that the LMIC is keeping a close eye on in the coming months. Katelyn, I guess first off, just starting with the cattle on feed report, what are we seeing this week?
So USDA NASS released the cattle on feed report for the February placements and cattle on feed as of March 1, and the report was largely in line with expectations. Placements in February were down about 7%. Marketings were about 95% of a year ago, which gives us an on-feed number for March 1 at about 4% below a year ago. So not necessarily too exciting. That was very in line with pre-report expectations and where we are in the cattle cycle today. One of the more interesting pieces of the Canadian cattle on feed report, which actually gets released a month earlier, is their numbers are declining just like U.S. numbers are, but they actually release a heifer number every single month, whereas the U.S. only releases it quarterly. And so from the Canada data, what we can tell is that heifers are still going on feed at a very high volume, and over 800 pounds was 46% higher than a year ago last month in terms of placements. And the other big category to increase was the under 600 pounds of placements for heifers on feed, and that was up 82% from a year ago. And so there doesn't seem to be a lot of heifer retention happening in Canada either. And so collectively, between the two countries, right now we're looking at cattle on feed inventories collectively down about 625 or so thousand head. And it doesn't appear that we're going to be changing that picture anytime soon in either country.
So what's the concern then when there's this type of activity taking place?
So what it means is that we are very unlikely to grow cattle supplies anytime soon. Both countries are really focused on drought. In Canada, it's really centering around the two larger cattle provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta. In the U.S., it's along that Great Plains corridor, so again, over cattle country. And so that's going to make it very difficult for us to retain heifers and increase breeding stock and thereby increasing cattle supplies in the future. And so we're just looking at smaller and smaller cattle supplies moving forward.
In terms of live cattle and feeder cattle, what type of activity there?
It was a choppy week on the futures market. Live cattle ended the week last week down a little bit in the summer contracts, but a little bit up in April in some of the more deferred contracts. On the feeder cattle side, we also ended the week down in the nearby contracts and a little bit higher in some of those more deferred contracts. But it was a relatively wild week. The big news more broadly is that we've had two larger regional banks collapse here in the U.S., and consumers, the stock market, and even the commodity markets are a little bit nervous about what that means and if it's going to be contained or we're facing some sort of systemic risk. And that's what the Federal Reserve is going to be looking at as they look to make a decision about rates in the coming week. And probably one of the bigger moves, cattle seem to escape relatively unscathed, but the lean hog futures lost about $10 a hundredweight last week from Tuesday on. And so some big market moves, largely I think in response to both that nervousness, and then there was a little bit of news about ASF in China and some rumors about some disease pressure that I think shook that market pretty hard.
There's always more than just the weather and other things that impact the market, isn't there? There's a lot of things globally that happen that affected just as much.
Sometimes it's hard to tease out exactly what happened in one day if you're not looking at it every minute, but this one we at least have some ideas of what could have caused that large of a decline in that market.
Is there any concern then that we could see this pop up in the cattle market as well, like it did with the hog market?
I don't know if it'll happen to that extent just because cattle supplies are so much tighter, but there is this question of does this economic turmoil lead to a decline in demand, which could impact particularly live cattle prices over the summer. Another thing that's hard to guess at this is what timing. So there was some conversations about the ripple effect in this banking event causing problems in Europe. Does it come back to the U.S., in 6 months or something as something else? And another consequence we weren't expecting. And so the big risk, I think, for the cattle side of things is going to be, does it shake demand this summer?
We've been battling inflation for several months now. Is that also a concern moving forward?
It is. I think from a multitude of perspectives, if we think about the U.S. consumer just facing higher prices across the board no matter what they're buying, and probably larger inflation or larger price increases in the food space, those grocery budget dollars just get tighter and tighter. And I guess what happens with fiscal policy and what the government decides to do in response to inflation is going to matter a lot. There's talk of either the Federal Reserve pausing their increasing interest rates, maybe they only increase a slight amount. All of those will have the impact on the consumer as well, even if they're trying to tackle, the very specific problem of inflation or some of this banking sector turmoil. And so what those consumer impacts are going to be a little bit murky here for a bit. But ultimately, beef demand has been very good for several years now, and we haven't really seen a slowdown at the meat case. And so we're just wondering if this is the event that maybe starts to change that picture a little bit.
Is that boxed beef that you're primarily talking about then?
So boxed beef is an aggregate measure that we like to talk about it because it kind of encompasses everything. But, more generally, right, the consumer probably buys ribeyes or they buy ground beef, something very specific, and maybe they change from ribeye down to ground beef if that's a little bit more in their budget. Those things can happen depending on the economic circumstance or changes in taste and preferences. So boxed beef is this collective number we like to reference as kind of this one price for meat, if you will. And that, for choice graded beef, that's holding $2.83 this week, or last week, I should say. And that's been holding a very strong price for several weeks now. Now, the interesting thing that I think is that the select price is over $2.70 and has been over that price for a while as well. And that means that choice select spread now has narrowed to about $10 a hundred or so, down from a very high level earlier this year. So we started the year with that spread being closer to $27 a hundredweight, which is an anomaly for that time of year. Usually first quarter of the year, we're under $10 in terms of spreads between choice and select box beef.
I know we're often looking for trends in the industry. Is there anything in particular that LMIC is keeping their eyes on as we move forward?
Well, we're trying to keep our eyes on all of it, and sometimes that can be a lot. But probably this demand picture is one of the things we're trying our best to wrap our arms around and to see if we can see any changes. And so we check out things like more anecdotally sometimes to just see what's being featured. Pork is going to start being featured fairly heavily, especially now that the price differential looks like it's going to get a little bit wider. Does that mean we see less beef move on the grocery store front? Hard to say, but that's one of the things we're watching. The other thing I would say, we're watching the negotiated cattle price. That's held $164.5 last week. Very, very good price. And if we start to see that come down in an environment where we have less and less cattle on feed, that might be an indication that there's a little bit of a demand problem here in the U.S., or maybe not a problem. That might be a mischaracterization. A little bit of demand slowing, let's say that.
And maybe finally, Katelyn, in terms of cash prices, what are we seeing there?
So last week, Dodge City popped back up after a week where 5 to 6s took a pretty big hit from the previous week. So 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were at 212 to 200 per hundredweight, then dropped back down to 188 the week before. And then last week, we popped back up to over 220 for 5 to 550 weights. And so some strong prices in there, and I would expect those to get a little better and better as your grass shows up and improves, but may take a hit if the opposite is true. Just depends on rain in this time of year and what's out there for forageabilities. Now, I mentioned the 5 area price was at 165. That's been a very steady and strong price, and I would expect that to kind of hold together maybe through April or so, but we may start to see that come down a little bit depending on what shakes out with both the demand situation, and typically that third quarter is one of the lower quarters of the year. However, given what I think is going to happen with cattle on feed inventory, I wouldn't be surprised to see a very strong third quarter this year in terms of prices.
Well, as always, we appreciate the update and all of the information. And if people need more information, how can they find that?
You can go to our website at www.lmic.info.
That's Katelyn McCullock, Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, with this week's Cattle Report. Again, for more information, visit lmic.info. That's lmic.info. Other cattle and grain marketing information is also available on the K-State College of Agricultural Economics website at agmanager.info, agmanager.info. This is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by our K-State Wheat and Forage Extension Specialist, Romulo Lollato, for a conversation on first hollow stem and wheat, especially when we're thinking about dual-purpose systems here in Kansas. So we're going to start with kind of an overview of dual grazing systems here in Kansas when it comes to wheat.
So whenever I first moved to Kansas, in fact to Oklahoma back in the day, right? For me, the concept of grazing wheat and then harvesting it for grain was something completely new. I had never heard of that before. And the reason I'm bringing that up today is because perhaps growers here take that for granted because they've always seen that. But this is very specific to this region of the world. And so this really positions Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas growers into a very advantageous role here in that they can make a profit out of the cattle gains and out of the wheat yield as well.
Yeah, very unique situation indeed, and one that you mentioned sometimes does lead to some of those yield losses, which is what we're going to try and avoid through our conversation today, really. But now's really that important time to start tracking the next development stage, I guess, after this grazing period that we've had, and now producers have the decision of when do I take my cattle off?
Yeah, so the wheat's planted in the fall, and it goes through quite a bit of forage production during that fall. Then it goes through a winter dormancy, right? And all of that time, the head of the crop that is going to become a spike later on hasn't really been produced, right? So if cattle are grazing now, they're just taking the foliage out of the crop. Now, you mentioned termination day, right? And that termination date is exactly, we're worried with that developing head. Because after the winter, when the crop goes through that vernalization period and now it becomes reproductive, the developing head is going to start to emerge from the crown of the crop and being pushed up the stem. Then once it's above ground, if the cattle continue grazing that crop, now we see very severe yield losses. Overall, there's been some long-term research done at Oklahoma State University with well-managed grazing systems that they were comparing a dual-purpose system, which was a crop planted 2-3 weeks earlier than optimal at a higher seeding rate with some extra nitrogen for that forage production, with cattle free grazing it. And just beside that, they had a fenced-out area where the same varieties were planted later, so during the optimal time, at a reduced seeding rate with standard nitrogen management. So very, very well-controlled conditions. After about 15 years or so, they realized that the average yield loss for well-managed conditions like that is about 14%. And roughly half of that, so 7% yield loss, comes from the grazing itself, so cattle removing foliage and then the crop needing to recover from that. But the other half just comes from early planting, right? We're planting out the optimal, and so that reduces our yields in about 7% as well. So in a well-managed situation, we can account for about 14% yield loss, and then you can get a pencil and do some calculations there to see, okay, well, with a 14% yield loss over your baseline, but how much beef are you actually producing and how much are you selling that beef for, right? It's a very high-quality forage, high in protein content that is available in a time of the year when there's not a lot of forage available. So it's a very, very particular system that brings our growers many advantages. Now, in Kansas, 10 to 15% of the area is grazed. It's not more than that. But you go to Oklahoma, it's 50 to 60% of the area, and in Texas, it's a very high number as well. So in the region itself, it's a very important number of acres of winter wheat that are grazed. Now, if we think of the conditions of the current season, right, which has been very rough since the beginning of it, unfortunately, if we go to western Kansas, half or two-thirds of the state of the wheat crops haven't really emerged yet. So we're not even talking about grazing there. We're just wanting the crop to emerge, right? More in central Kansas and into most of Oklahoma, the crop kind of emerged on time due to some rains there late September, early October, but that's about as much moisture as it has had. What determines forage production in these systems? How much moisture we have available and temperatures regime in the fall. If we have a lot of moisture available and warm temperatures in the fall, considering that nitrogen is not limiting, right, our nutrition is not limiting, we produce a lot of forage. If we have a dry, cool fall, then we produce less forage. And it has been an extremely dry fall, even though temperatures may have been near normal there in the fall, but it has been extremely dry. So in our own research plots that we measured at forage production near Hutchinson, this year we're measuring anywhere from 300 to 600 pounds of dry matter produced in the fall across varieties, right, depending on variety. And that compares to perhaps 2,000 plus last year. So we're really in a low forage production year. So that's the situation that we were going into the fall this year. Not a lot of forage out there. And that's the situation that our growers are right now, deciding whether to remove that cattle from their pastures.
Sure. So with current conditions, we've already been set up for a kind of rough year in terms of the wheat that was out there, and then adding the stress of grazing onto that potentially kind of an iffy situation. So we want to make sure the timeline from now on, we're setting ourselves up for success, right?
Yes, we need to help this crop out however we can, right? And you brought a very good point there based on the drought conditions that we have had this far. And if you look at the forecast as well, which on the long run is promising, that change from La Nina to El Nino, right? But that's not probably due until sometime in the middle or late summer. So for this spring, unfortunately, I don't think we have too good chances of above average rainfall there. So yield losses based on grazing past first hollow stem. So I mentioned that 14% yield loss as a well-managed system, meaning we're finishing it at first hollow stem. If we leave cattle grazing past first hollow stem and we have dry and hot conditions like seems like this spring may bring us, we can have an additional 5% per day yield loss. Right, so if you're supposed to take the cattle off today and you leave it there 2 extra days, there's a 10% ding in your yield that you have later on. So it's a very steep yield loss. So that's why the crop is already under a lot of stress. If there's any intention of harvesting that crop for yield, we need to be very timely in removing that cattle from wheat pastures right now.
I guess many producers out there tracking that first hollow stem, it's kind of a hard situation. Like you said, it's day dependent. We're talking about 5% of yield loss per day that this is left grazed on. So when it comes to tracking and understanding, is my crop in its first hollow stem stage, how can producers best do that?
So first hollow stem is field specific, meaning that even if you have the same variety planted in 2 neighboring fields, they might differ in the date of first hollow stem because of soil type, because of microclimate and temperatures difference between fields, and because of how harsh we're grazing it. So many things impact that first hollow stem. So in each field, producers should go out there and select an area that is just outside the fence, meaning an area that has not been grazed yet, and select a few different plants and pull those plants whole, select the main stem out of those plants and slice it open from the bottom part until up and try to see where that developing head is. If there is roughly half an inch in between the developing head and the crown level, then it means that it's time to remove cattle from that first hollow stem. Now, we measure from outside the fence, from a non-grazed area, because grazing itself already delays the reproductive developing a little bit. So if we're removing based on that ungrazed area, we're going to be more on the safe side, right? So very important to go and select that ungrazed area to make these measurements. Take a look at 5 to 10 main stems, so select the main tiller in each of those plants, and remove the cattle if you have about half an inch of development under that head, in between the head and the crown.
Sure, absolutely. And I understand if producers are kind of, looking at the calendar and they're thinking, well, is it now the time for me to go out there and check, or should I wait a few more days? I know there's a tool on the Kansas Mesonet that kind of can help with that timing, right?
Yes, absolutely. So here in my program at K-State, we try to inform growers in as many ways as we can, right? So we have a few different efforts there that help you make the decision, although, again, it is field-specific and it needs to be checked in order to make an informed decision. One of those tools is the one that we developed with the Kansas Mesonet. So if growers go to Kansas Mesonet and tools, there's a first hollow stem tool there that will give you a probability that an early or a late maturing variety has already reached first hollow stem in different parts of the state. That tool, it was developed just based on soil temperatures. So that uses Mesonet readings of soil temperature that integrates with a very simple crop model that determines growth and development based on temperature accumulation. So that tool is out there. Again, it can be used as a tool. It's not the one that you're not going to make your full decision based on that. But if that tool is telling you have a 50-75% chance of first hollow stem in an early maturing variety, for example, or whatever maturity class you're growing, there's a very good chance that that first hollow stem might already be there. So again, going out there and checking those fields and making that decision. Other sources of information that we try to put out for growers as well is, again, we're measuring first hollow stem in about 30 varieties or so. We measure that in Hutchinson. So there's a lot of wheat that is grazed south of Hutchinson. And for those that are grazed south of Hutchinson, very likely these will occur earlier just because it's warmer as well. But we're measuring that date of first hollow stem in about 30 varieties or so. Our last measurement was March 6th, and all of the varieties had started to develop a little bit of hollow stem, but they were at less than a fifth of an inch yet back then. So just beginning, right? We have had some cold temperatures since then, so I don't expect them to have moved forward too much. But if temperatures increase, and especially if there's any rain, hopefully it can really move fast. So we're measuring that a couple of times every week and sending those out in e-updates through the Department of Agronomy as well. So that's another source that producers can be looking at and have an idea of how things are faring in that Hutchinson region for that set of 30 varieties that we're looking at.
Absolutely. Yeah, two great resources there. You mentioned the Kansas Mesonet, of course, as an estimation tool, and then the agronomy e-updates that you all offer weekly. So that is an excellent tool to subscribe to as well. I'll link to both of those in the show notes of today's show, which can be found on agtoday.net. But Romulo, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
Thanks, Samantha. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Wheat and Forage Extension Specialist Romulo Lollato joining us for a conversation on tools to estimate first hollow stem in wheat. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are ending today's show with our wildlife segment for the week, and joining us for that this week is K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Specialist Joe Gerken. So, Joe, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me back. Always great to be here.
Absolutely. Always great to have you. And this week you wanted to talk about plants and ponds because, believe it or not, it's getting to that time of year where we need to start worrying about these things.
I know. Hard to believe it's already spring, or almost spring, I guess. But water temperatures are warming up. They're probably around 50 or 55 degrees right now. We start to see algae popping up. And this is the easiest time of year to get ahead of some of the problems with plants in our ponds. So thought we could spend a few minutes chatting about that.
Absolutely. And you've already been getting some calls, some concerns about this subject. So algae, when it comes to the options for treatment here, I know there's some differences short-term versus long-term. So let's start with those short-term options.
Sure. So filamentous algae, a lot of people call it pond moss. It's an algae that grows on the bottom of a pond. It collects air and it floats up to the top of the pond. We're starting to see little pockets of that now. And this is the time where we can kind of do something about it. Most people don't tend to call me until their pond's completely covered. And at that point, there's not much we can do. But in the short term, this is the time of year where you'd want to go out and do an herbicide application. So a chelated copper algicide is something that you would want to use, and you can spray that onto your algae and it will kill it. But that's kind of just a short-term solution. We're not really addressing what's making that algae or other plants in our system grow up. And so we wanted to make sure that we are doing something longer term other than just spraying herbicide all the time. Let's address some of the problems that are causing that excessive plant growth in the first place.
Absolutely. So some of those issues that come to mind when you first think about algae problems in ponds, what are some of those long-term options treatment-wise?
So the main one that comes to mind is siltation, and so our depths of our ponds tend to get shallower over time, and that's especially true in ponds that have livestock access. So cattle or sheep can walk into the ponds. They tend to track sediment with them or erode the banks, and that can fill in ponds over time. So getting shallower ponds, introduction of nutrients. So livestock can introduce nutrients. We add fertilizer to the watershed. That can all make it to the pond. One important little thing to mention, we tend to think of nutrients in the pond itself, but things that we're doing in the watershed can really impact the pond and the water quality of that pond. So we need a management program that focuses on the pond, but also how the water is getting into that pond.
Absolutely. So keeping cattle away from these ponds and the surrounding areas, I guess, in cases of erosion, runoff, things like that?
Yeah, so cattle can cause problems with runoff. They add a lot of nutrients to the watershed. There are things that we can do throughout the watershed. So we've talked about vegetative buffers before. We think about those around our pond, having a pretty little strip around our pond that's grown up where those plants can take out those nutrients. It's also important, though, that maybe we have some of those along the streams or the creeks that are feeding that pond. So let's think about building up some buffers, maybe keeping livestock, if we can, out of those waterways that are leading to the pond. Another big concern with plants that I see are woody plants growing on dams. So over time, those roots can infiltrate the dam and they can cause dam failure. And I just went out to a pond last week where there was a stream running through a pond, and that very quickly will drain that pond. So if we're thinking about not only the plant side of things, but having access for cattle or livestock to be able to drink, and that can go away very quickly. It's important that we keep the integrity of that dam in place.
An important resource for sure. And if people are tuning in and they haven't listened to our past segments before talking about these buffer zones, what are some good plants to maybe keep in those?
Any pollinator plants, shrubs, what we would tend to call weeds are what we really like. Milkweed's really good. But just having something there is the most important thing. So if you're just starting out, you don't want to spend any money, just fence out your livestock if you can, or don't mow in the area if you're mowing around your pond. Anything that we can get to grow up other than woody plants, so you wouldn't want trees, but any types of grass or forbs that you can grow up would be really beneficial in the ponds.
Absolutely, and might as well encourage some butterflies potentially or some pollinators around if you're planting milkweed per se.
Right, so, butterflies love it, birds really love it. You'll see wildlife in general will be more attracted to your pond if it has that buffer around it. So provides a lot of benefits for the pond itself. One important thing to mention, it doesn't have to be entirely around your pond or entirely throughout your watershed. If you want to have access to get to your pond, that's fantastic. So you can trim little areas, make sure that you're still enjoying your pond, but let as much of that grow up as you can.
Great reminders for sure, Joe. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Fisheries and Aquatic Specialist Joe Gerken, ending today's show with our wildlife segment for the week. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.